Can you just tell us a little bit about your background? And I know, you obviously wear a few hats in, sports performance, coaching, strength conditioning, physiotherapy, the list goes on. But, we're really obviously, happy to hear from a range of those experiences.
Yeah, so my background initially, I studied physiotherapy at Melbourne University, graduating in 2010. And then basically I transitioned some of my knowledge from that also into my next degree, which was a master's in exercise science, done through ECU, majoring in strength and conditioning. And my background in sport actually was heavily related to track and field. And so I've kind of combined all of those in, we've developed a clinic that's more of a sports performance and physiotherapy injury clinic. And that sort of specializes in, trying to help people with sports injuries, but also in sports performance as well. Since that time, in about 2015, I started coaching track and field with a senior adult group. And I specialize in sprint training and coaching. And from there, basically, it's developed into the very nice opportunity to be able to coach a number of people that have made the Australian team, including a couple that went to the Olympics in 2021 and Commonwealth Games, World University Games, all that kind of thing. So it's been a bit of a journey, but yeah, as you said, I wear a few hats across coaching, sports performance, and obviously physiotherapy as well.
And I guess when you're working across those population groups, and then obviously when you just getting general population people come to your clinic, why do you think it's such a strength to have a strong understanding of biomechanical principles, whether that's force production, power production, understanding how the limbs are moving through space and time? How is that beneficial to what you do day to day?
Well, typically, we've been working on what we believe is the sort of model for the development of injury. And it doesn't really matter if it's, as you said, someone in the general population or if it's someone who's coming from a sporting background. But there's usually sort of three key pillars that influence that. And one, as physios particularly, we spend a lot of time on is this idea of, tissue properties and capacities. We always look at what's their range of motion, what's their strength like. That's a big area, and it's obviously one of the key things that you will continue to do and spend time on. The other big one that really blew up, a lot of the work came out of the research by a guy named Tim Gavitt, especially in Australia, and looking at things like load and training load and what effect that had of how quickly you were increasing that training load. And it's the same with, it could be an occupational activity. Someone all of a sudden has never done any physical work, and then, they're working as a tradesperson. They're going to obviously have a huge spike in their load. If they develop, say, a back injury, it might be to do with the fact that all of a sudden they're taking on this manual labor. But the other third key pillar is biomechanics, and that's how you move and the forces that are related to that. And if you think about it from a really basic point of view, the interaction between those three key factors are all combined by what actually happens when you move. Because in the biomechanical sense, what you're actually looking for is what type of forces, what kind of torques, what kind of influence is going through the material properties of your tissue, right? And does that tissue, when you go and do your analysis of your tissue properties, does that tissue actually have the capability to deal with those stresses? Because if it doesn't, then it's going to alter the capability of that tissue to withstand that. And typically that's what we see is it's either, and this gets a little bit technical, but for those that are interested in the biomechanical things, in the area of engineering, there's in materials engineering, you look at something called like a stress life curve. And what that is it basically tells you how much stress a material can actually withstand based on either the number of cycles of stress. So think about the idea of, say, if you're lifting a box, it's going to be influenced very heavily by how heavy that box is or how many times you lift that box. So your tissue, say, if it's, we think about a back, if you're picking up a box over and over and over and over again, even if the box is particularly light, you may end up developing, say, back pain because you actually have lifted that box 150 times. And the thing that's going to influence that even more is, as you mentioned, the biomechanics of how you lift. Now, we know with lifting, there's multiple ways to actually do that that are going to change, particularly things like the lever arm that's going through the spine. And that effect will actually change how much stress is going through that particular tissue. So if you don't understand the movement and you don't understand the type of forces that are going on with those type of activities, you start to miss one of the key pillars that influences how much stress is going through a tissue. And if you can't see that, you may go through this process where you're continually thinking, oh, I need to add more range of motion or more strength to a particular tissue, whether it's a back or a hamstring or whatever it is, but you're missing the fact that maybe their running mechanics are actually putting them at greater stress, or their lifting technique is quite poor, and that's why they keep getting back pain from a particular task, say, as they're lifting in a manual labor job or gardening or whatever it is. And those are the kind of things that if you tie those together, you start to understand that you can fit those pieces to reduce someone's injury risk by correcting something like their mechanics, very much through understanding what the forces that may be going through those particular tissues. And we're very lucky because if you actually go and look for it, there's lots of literature, particularly in ergonomics and biomechanics, that actually describes the type of forces that are going through structures in different tasks. You know,
Okay.
you can go and find, if you're someone who works, say, as a physio in occupational arena, you can actually go find, okay, what are the forces going through someone's spine when they're doing, you know, this type of lifting with a rotation? So it's got, you know, a torque element to it. What's actually happening there? And you can start to build some of those things up so that when you're doing your rehab, you know, I need to expose them to at least this level of biomechanical tasks so that I know that their tissue has developed the capability of dealing with that ergonomic stress. And so if you don't actually address that, you're missing a really key piece for them being able to fully rehabilitate back to a level of activity that they need to, for whether it's their, you know, task, job, you know, general hobby, activity, whatever that may be.
One thing you mentioned I thought was interesting is when you talk about, I guess, the biomechanics of, you know, the whole body through a particular movement task compared to, you know, perhaps the biomechanics of what's happening at the tissue, and that interaction between, you know, particularly what you might do between the muscle and tendon and then the bone. Can you sort of talk to that, sort of how, you know, how granular you might get? Because I imagine, you know, when physiotherapy students graduate, you know, there's obviously going to be an experience level and a steep learning curve of, I'm just looking at the body biomechanics, but I really need to understand what's happening at the muscular level or the neuromuscular level as well.
Yeah, I think it's something that's been really interesting and something that's developed nicely is our understanding and our ability to measure some of these things continues to evolve. And as I said, the literature is actually really strong in the biomechanical sense that you can get an idea of, people are trying to find what are the forces going through the spine in a particular area. You know, people work like Stuart McGill. If you go and have a look at some of the work there, you'll see he's very, very strong on building some of those models to get an understanding of that. And then that'll tell you, like in the erector, you know, spine, so understanding your anatomy and being able to tie with what is the actual forces and how much, you know, rotation is going on, how much torque is happening because of the lifting technique. Then if you look at something, as you said, like lower limb, especially with running, obviously your background is in running and running coaching as well. We know that there is a big difference between, say, the ground reaction force, so that's the total force that comes off the ground when someone makes contact with the ground, and actually what happens at specific joints and what happens at specific tissue levels. So if we look at something like a ground reaction force with fast running, and there's lots of work being done on this over a period of time, but for those who are interested, the work of, say, Peter Wayand and Ken Clark over the last 10, 15 years has really started to elucidate exactly what that looks like. We see that, you know, fast sprinters are running at, say, 4 to 5 times body weight through their whole, you know, force applying to the ground. But if you actually look at the specific joints, if you start to look at something, say, like the ankle or the knee, we're looking at 8, 9 times body weight going through those joints. And that gives you an idea of, okay, just because it's 4 to 5 times at the whole body, the actual amount of contribution that I need from those other portions is actually even higher again. And then, as you mentioned, it goes even more granular than that, where we're starting to look at things like the contraction velocities and the changes that happen within, say, muscle to tendon tissue and what that actually means for, say, rehabilitation. Because we know that one of the main functions for something like a tendon is actually not just transmitting force from the muscle to the bone so that you can get movement at a joint. It does a lot of stabilization, but the other big thing that it does enormously is regulate the velocity of the contraction and how much, you know, we talk about it, and when we say stiffness, we're not talking about compliance in regards to, say, tissue tone. We're talking about how well it can actually create stabilization. It regulates the stiffness of the tendon. And for those, you've done your anatomy, if you're looking at things like Golgi tendon organs, the main function of these sensory organs is that they regulate how much tension is occurring across that tissue. So if you have an understanding of that, what it gives you the opportunity to do is know that when you're doing your rehabilitation, and this is something that we've been working on a lot more recently, we say muscle strain injuries. When we know that there's involvement of, and it's become more common because MRI technology is getting better and better, so we get much more granular. We know it's an epimysial injury, or we know that it's involving the central tendon of a hamstring or something like that. When someone strains their muscle, we start to get an idea of, okay, yes, they may get their tensile strength back, so that's the amount of force that they can create with a particular task. But we also need them to be able to do that at high velocity, because we know that from a biomechanical sense within the tissue, the tendon is actually functioning to regulate that stiffness. So we start looking at things like the rate of force development. How quickly can you create that contraction force? And how well you're going to be able to create those forces in different tasks. Because if you don't think about that, you potentially send someone back out onto the field thinking, oh, they can produce X amount of newtons of force. And for those people who have been exposed to it, obviously it's become really popular because we have things like the Nord board research that's really pushed this idea of, okay, measure the force output. And in that task, typically, we're trying to send people back with the number that got floated around was around 350 to 400 newtons of force was a level of protection. But obviously that's a slow task. That's not a fast task. So the relation between that and, say, flat out running when you're on the field is not exactly the same thing, which is why we haven't necessarily seen a complete amelioration of, say, hamstring injuries. And that's understanding the ergonomic demand, that biomechanical task, enough to know force is one thing, but rate of force development and velocity of the contraction are different elements of that. And you need to be able to put those pieces together to know, okay, my rehabilitation has a component of developing, force output. So that's, maximum strength type training to that tissue, but then it needs to go to sort of power training. It needs to go to really high velocity, what we consider elastic tasks, before we even think, okay, they're ready to run at 100% intensity. So all of those elements come together. And that's why, if you're not putting those pieces together, you're missing, as I said before, part of the puzzle that gets you back to the rehabilitation, where you are quite confident that someone's not going to re-injure something.
Yeah, I think you raised some good points, just which I'd love you to talk to. And I think one thing would be, just the clinical and practical assessment methods that you'd use to, initially, diagnose what's happened with when an athlete comes in. So whether that's the Nord board or some other tools that you might use, but also trying to track that athlete across the injury timeline and know, all right, at specific periods, are they progressing as best as you would like? What are some of the biomechanical assessments that you might use at start, and are they the same before they go out, or do you use different assessment techniques, prior to returning to performance?
So they do evolve, but some of them stay the same and some of them evolve. So again, we're in a really lucky time, and when I first started practicing as a physio, it wasn't as easy because you didn't have these tools readily available, or if you did, they were really expensive, and it was mainly universities that had some of these things. I'm talking about things about dynamometry, force plates. These are things that are really readily available, and we use every single day over and over and over. So one of the things that we do, say if someone has muscle strain type injury, we will do our best to create an opportunity to measure what the force output is. And obviously it's not an exact science in the sense of you don't know what their pre-injury output would have been. But there are obviously other metrics that we can get from our testing, but from a really basic sense for us as clinicians, the two big things that we look for in our force plate testing, for say muscle injury or dynamometry testing, is peak force output, in newtons or kilos, depending on how you set your system. And the second thing is the rate of force development, so how quickly you can create that force in newtons per second, right?
Just in a counter movement jump, or a few different options?
No, we actually do like muscle testing using our force plates. So say for instance, say someone strains a calf, we'll set them up in, we'll lock them into say a seated calf position, we'll lock them into a standing position, and they have to push against the force plate to try and get maximum force output through that complex. We do the hamstring one. We don't actually use a Nord board, and I won't get into why or why not, because it might annoy some people, but essentially the main things that we do two tests. One is a maximum isometric test looking at 90-degree bridge, right, with the foot elevated at 90 degrees. And then the second one we do is a straight leg elevated bridge task. Again, both isometric under maximum resistance.
And you'll do it with the non-injured leg as well, and then look for imbalances or asymmetries, or just something to guide you back to
exactly.
equal with the
Yeah, so yeah, it's perfect that you asked it like that. So essentially what we do is we measure both sides. Obviously, as I said, it's hard to know what the injured side would have been prior to, because obviously some people do have asymmetry anyway, but we tend to use the uninjured side as well as some normative values that some of the systems that we use actually already give you these normative values, but we have our own metrics that we've been trying to develop and kind of collate over time by seeing more people. So general populace, we think, okay, they should be able to create this many newtons of force. Someone who's athletic, should be here, and if it's an elite athlete, they need to be, right up here. So we will measure that, and we'll give an idea of, okay, what current level do they have on their uninjured side? What current level do they have on their injured side? And typically there's some sort of discrepancy, and that discrepancy actually gives us an idea of the severity of the injury. So typically, and we were talking about this the other day, it varies depending on the literature that you read, but if you look at someone like, say we'll use hamstring injuries as a guide, because most people are pretty aware of what that kind of looks like. If we look at the task, we tend to find that, say for instance, colloquially using a grade 1 system, there are other systems of muscle classification in injury now. There's the Barcelona system, there's the British athletic system, there's different ones, but essentially one of the key ones that we'll look for is, okay, what's a grade 1 type injury? And those ones are typically, your first level. People might be out for a few weeks from competition, but they can generally walk straight after and all those kind of things. But what we see is somewhere between a 10 and 20% force output change, and a rate of force development is usually less than 30% difference after that injury. Typically, we see with a grade 2, it's between 20 and 50% of force reduction. And if it's a grade 3 or involves potentially a tendon injury, we see more than 50% reduction. And some people, basically, they can't put any force to it. So the reduction in their force output is going to be, 100% or more, right? But these are the things that start to give us an idea of okay, they really can't put a lot of force through there. That injury is actually more severe. So that gives us information straight away. And then we actually use that through our process to say, come back to it, if it's every week or every 2 weeks, to go, okay, is this tracking in the way that we want? And one of the things that we find, particularly with injuries that are in that grade 1, grade 2 for muscle injury, we tend to find that the force output, so the peak force that they can create in those isometric tasks at both the bent and straight leg, they vary a little bit, but they tend to come back relatively quickly. So you might have someone who has a grade 1 hamstring strain, and you think, okay, they'll get back to footy in 3 or 4 weeks. They might actually be, 10 days later, their peak force might actually be back to what symmetrical with the uninjured side. And you think, okay, that's good. And in the past, even I'll admit openly, I stupidly would have gone, oh great, you're not far away. But then you look at the rate of force development, and it's still nowhere near. It still might be 20% or more down. And that's the gap that we've been really trying to close. And that's where we're so lucky now that we have this technology to measure these things, because in the past we would have said, okay, you're ready to start functional tasks that are a little bit more intense, faster running, plyometric tasks. Maybe you can go into some match simulation stuff. But now, until I see that gap really close in the rate of force, I won't allow them to do it. And then I have some metrics that we've kind of, with my team at the clinic, we've been kind of thinking about and developing for a period of time. But we're starting to look at things like, okay, what do we think is a protective level for people? As I said, I mentioned before, the Nord, they said, okay, if you can produce 350 to 400 newtons, it's a pretty protective level. To me, the rate of force development number in relation to that peak force is really important. So,
and you look at, you know, I mean, what's the standard? Is it 150, 300 milliseconds?
basically, we're mostly just looking at, actually, for me, it's about the maximum multiple that they can hit. So it sounds a bit weird, but basically, if their peak force is, I don't know, 300 newtons, right?
Mm.
I would like their rate of force to be minimum of 4 times their peak force. So we're talking about, you know, like 1200 newtons per second.
Okay.
If they can't hit that 4 times, I'm concerned that their velocity, capabilities, and their contraction is too slow. Right.
Okay.
And that's where I've noticed that if I've stupidly sent people back and it's only, oh, it's like 3, it's not too bad. And they go, oh, they don't necessarily get re-injured, but they're like, I can still feel my hamstring like after I do a bit, or it's fatiguing, and I feel like, you know, halfway through training, I'm actually starting to get issues again. And so what I've noticed is 4 seems to be about the number. And there's nothing published on that at the moment. I keep asking.
It's just a threshold which you've found from experience?
Yeah, well, we've been using this system for 3 years, right? So
Okay.
we've just been slowly collecting data, and obviously because, you know, my background's in track and a lot of my staff are involved in it as well, we get lots and lots and lots of muscle strain injuries come in for different team sports, for you know, sprinting, and that seems to be a metric that is giving us some information. You know, obviously, yeah, it's not anecdotal, it's more in the sense of, you know, it's empirical. We've been collecting this data. We've probably got hundreds of people who can say, okay, this has actually worked, but it's not published yet, and then, you know, we're not researchers, so we're probably not going to publish it. But maybe that's something that you can do with some of your.
You never know. Yeah, we could do that.
I hope that's answered, you know, what you were asking.
Yeah, and I think I guess from that, and your experience is obviously so vast, because like we said at the start, you know, you wear lots of different hats in your role. But how do you go from, you know, they've come in to see you for an injury, whether it's hamstring or, you know, perhaps a longer like ACL, and then you've got the outputs from your assessments, and then how do you, I guess, bridge that gap between, I know the biomechanics of the injury. How do I know, you know, what type of exercise types, you know, specific muscle contractions which you need to write as your intervention, rather than, I don't know, maybe something general or ambiguous, go and do a few leg extension, leg curls. You know, how do you actually bridge that gap? Is it just experience, or, you know, your involvement with going out to, you know, probably, I imagine, volunteering at times early on, and now obviously just you know, quite a well-equipped gym now?
Well, I always say this because we have, you know, we have a number of young clinicians that work with us, and I always say to them, because it is a big thing that they don't believe biomechanics is necessarily an area for them to understand, and we push them. You know, like our clinic, we use that 3-pillar system. So it's like you need to have understanding in each of those areas, because if you miss one of them, you're in trouble. And so I'm always really big. Go and look at the literature. You know, like, it's one of those things of, we get sometimes scared of going outside of, you know, healthcare literature, but go and actually read, you know, some of the sports science and the biomechanical research to say, okay, like, what are the forces on the knee, as you mentioned, when someone's doing a change of direction or a cutting task? What are the forces? What are the torques that are going into the knee? And what are the tasks that seem to be most stressful? Because that will start to give you an idea of what your gradations may be and progressions may be in your rehab. Now, obviously, most of us gravitate, and I'm the same, we gravitate towards protocols that someone's already tracked this out for you. They go, oh yeah, I know this physio, they work with, you know, Liverpool, you know, football club in the EPL, therefore they know what the protocol should be, and I just copy those steps.
Yep.
And that's really dangerous, to be honest with you, because you have an individual in front of you who has different movement capabilities and different strengths, particularly to, say, an elite football player in the EPL. So what you need to be thinking about is, what are the features that I see in this individual? And whilst I might know those steps, you know, what are the pieces in between that I can use? You know, I maybe, do I need to regress, and do I need to play with that? So the first thing I always say to people is, go and read about, because most tasks, as weird as they are, whether they're just occupational tasks or sporting tasks, there's literature on them. Most injuries have biomechanical literature on them, as I said, ACL or hamstring or running or whatever, you know, bone stress injuries, those kind of things. They have research on them. So go and get the foundation of that. Then I think the big thing is, we always talk about this concept of developing a bit of a framework around safe to fail experiments. And what we mean by that is you build your rehabilitation plan knowing what your step up and your step down is depending on what you see in that particular individual. Right? So if someone is flying through the tasks, it's not a bad thing for you to step them a little bit ahead of where they were, because you can see that they're actually meeting that criteria quite easily. And the big thing that I think is really important now that we have the technology to do it, even simple technology like video, we all have phones and iPads and all those kind of things. There are great applications that will allow you to measure some of these things. Now, you can speak to the validity and the reliability of some of these biomechanical 2D video applications. You know that research more than I do by far, but they give you a guide. They give you an opportunity to kind of look at these things. And so it takes, it's probably 3 or 4 things. The first one is, as you said, just be interested in that activity. Go and watch the activity, take video of the activity, actually try to understand what's going on, read the literature, and then be open to the idea of formulating, as I said, this framework around your rehabilitation and knowing, okay, I need to run some safe to fail experiments here. Can they hop? All right. When they hop, if I take video of it, what happens? Are they getting, a valgus shift in their knee? Are they able to control it? Are they having to move their trunk heavily forward? What are they doing with that task? And am I happy with that? Or is that outside of what I think is a healthy bandwidth for that, say, knee joint to be undertaking now that we're 3, 4, 5 months into their ACL rehabilitation, for instance? And you've just got to be willing to, pick these things up and learn and set safety parameters around it, because obviously you don't want to, move someone too quickly. But the big thing that you have to be aware of is there is information out there, and I always encourage people to ask people. Don't be scared to actually go and ask another clinician. Usually you're not working on your own all the time, so ask other people as well. So there's 3 or 4 pillars. If I can probably summarize it, as you said, go and actually observe the task and understand what that's about. Maybe take video of it, read the literature on that. Make sure you've got a framework around what your plan is for their rehabilitation, and then lean on people in the industry that have done these kind of things to get an idea of where those biomechanical tasks or rehabilitation processes are going to sit.
Yeah, I think you've answered that really well, and I guess it just shows that perhaps some people have a one thought of a physiotherapist role of maybe just sitting in the clinician's room, when obviously there's lots of different aspects to
it's so dangerous.
The role as well.
It's so dangerous to do that. I know that you obviously wear a number of different hats as well, and I think this idea of being a specialist is actually, I think, a very dangerous idea in something like physio. I think it's very dangerous in your sports performance and, say, strength and conditioning as well, which is a couple of the hats that I wear. I think that you should have a good foundation across a number of different areas. Now, you might have really strong suits in certain things, like I'm really interested and I've done a lot of work in overhead athletes, and I want to work with tennis players, and I'm good with shoulders or whatever it is. But you should understand the other elements, because as you mentioned at the start, the body doesn't work in singular sort of joints or in singular sort of limbs. It is a whole complex, and you need to understand that this kinetic chain actually works together. And so you need to have an idea of how these pieces fit together, because not only, even if it's just a pain presentation, where you think, okay, maybe this is coming because, say if it's a shoulder, I think this pain presentation, they're getting impingement in their shoulder when they do overhead, tasks, is actually because their thoracic spine doesn't have rotation, doesn't have extension. You don't have the necessarily upward gliding of your scapula. So you're actually causing impingement at the subacromial joint, of your subacromial structures, like your rotator cuff tendons, actually because you have poor range of motion, and that's a pain presentation that might be affected heavily by you understanding that they need to have, movement capabilities and tissue compliance in another part of the chain. So it's really important that you are aware not only of the biomechanics, but as you just mentioned, having an idea of where these pieces fit together. And the big factor that I think really helps you if you have not only knowledge in different areas, but if you don't have the knowledge in areas, is as I mentioned before, go and ask people, and don't. It's a really, really strong temptation for physios. So, this is to all you guys listening. Listen to other people that have more experience in different areas to you, even if they are not the area that you work in. So the big one is coaches, for instance. If you work with a basketball team and you're not an expert basketball player, or you haven't worked in that environment before, ask the coach, why are they stepping this way? Why are they rotating when they do that? Why are they holding the ball here? Right? They sound like really dumb questions, but they will give you a really strong understanding. And people, this is a personal gripe, but I think people underestimate the knowledge that coaches have across lots of different areas. It's one of the key skills that as a coach you kind of need to have is you develop a foundation across lots of things. Not only the technical and tactical aspects of playing a sport, but also understanding biomechanics, understanding injury, understanding conditioning, understanding strength elements, and all these features that sometimes you go, oh, they're just, they're the basketball coaches. Like, go and ask them a question. And the same thing happens with other professionals. These days, I probably ask for help much more than I did even when I was a younger clinician. If someone, say for instance, for me, presents with a bone stress injury that I've seen a number of times before, because they're, an athlete who does lots of running, and they can be general populace, or they can be, the first thing I do, even though I probably know exactly what they're going to say, is I send them to the sports doctor. I just don't want to present in a way where I'm getting ahead of myself. Whilst I understand bone healing mechanics and I understand the physiology of it, and I've seen lots and lots of bone stress injuries, I lean on the expert and say to the sports doctor, okay, this is your bread and butter. What timeline do you have for this person? What other medical elements do we need to look at? And the same goes, as I said, if you're working in an environment where you're getting to the later stage of a rehabilitation and you're not confident with the last phases of someone's return, say maybe to activity or sport, that's where you bring in, the exercise physiologist, you bring in the strength and conditioning coach to say, look, I'm really happy with this early part. I feel like we've got all the tissue capacities. I've taught them the basic movements. I'm comfortable with those, but I'm really not that comfortable with really high level plyometrics that they're going to need for basketball. I'm not happy with my own understanding of, the dynamics of the cutting and the different forces that are going to go through their joints with basketball. Go and see someone who's like, okay, I do strength conditioning for basketball and have done for years. Go and speak to them and say, what other things do I put in, or even refer them on and say, I'm happy with my area that I can influence. I now need you to go and work with this person. These are the reasons. Make sure you've got, established a relationship with that person, keep the communication really open, but you've got to be willing to work with that person, because your knowledge will end somewhere, and we're all clever. Everyone's clever who's in this game. It's knowing where your limitations are and being willing to be humble enough to say, okay, this person actually has more capability in this area. And sometimes it's actually just a time resource issue. If you're a physio and your appointment time is 20 minutes or half an hour, you can't spend an hour or an hour and a half with someone who needs to do rehabilitation for that long. You can't sit there and go into the rehab gym, or you can't go into the basketball court necessarily and say, oh, we need to do cutting tasks for the next 45 minutes. You may not have the opportunity. If you do, great, but you may not have that opportunity. So that's where you bring in those people. It's like, can I work with the basketball assistant coach? Can I work with the strength and conditioning coach for the team? So that it's like, okay, they're ready to do all these cutting tasks. I'm not going to be able to do it. Can you take them through it? Send them do some videos. We can collaborate, communicate, work out whether they're tolerating it well. The athlete, the patient is heavily involved in that process. Yep, I pulled up okay. I didn't get any swelling of my knee joint after we went back to, 45 minutes of different basketball tasks. Okay, we can increase the volume on that. And that's where it's about working out, okay, how do we collaborate as a team, and who's driving the bus on that. But that's, that's all about, teamwork really. And it's an important part of getting anyone to the level that they need to, because we don't all have the answers in every domain.
And I think you sort of talked to, physiotherapy being such a integral part of that allied health area, where they're often situated in commercial spaces with other factors such as OTs or EPs or in a surgery or strength conditioning space. So I guess being able to be collaborative and I guess it's almost like really easy professional development for you as well.
Oh, totally. You can learn so much from other professions, even just sitting in with people at times and just seeing what they do, and how they address a problem. Because we all have slightly different velocities when we go across these different professions. Even like there's a really weird thing where physios don't like to pay much attention to what chiropractors and osteopaths do, right?
That's a pretty dicey space, isn't it? Physiotherapies and chiropractic.
Yeah, it may be, but the thing is, like, most of the time we're not willing to listen to each other, even if there are pockets of knowledge that we may be able to gain from that. Like I always find that really interesting. People go, "Oh, I'm not listening to them because they're this," and they say the same thing about physio. But it's like, I can learn from you, you can learn from me, and some of the things some things you're saying I'm not going to use, and that's okay. But
yes,
you're much better off learning from other people and taking, we all know this as clinicians, as professionals. You steal as much as you can, right? And I don't say that in a silly way. Like, you pick up and you take what is useful for you in your environment with people that you work with to get the best outcomes because we're all the same. People who get into these sort of professional services, we always tend to have this slant towards trying to get the best outcome for the people that we work with. And that doesn't matter if you're an accountant, it doesn't matter if you're a strength conditioning coach, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor. You're always just trying to get the best outcome for the people that you work with. And so if you can get more information, you can get more skills, you can get a better way of approaching a problem, you'd be silly not to use it. And I think that you need to be open to that across whatever it is. As you said, if you're in a multidisciplinary clinic, just sit in or even ask the OT, as you said, how do you address, chronic elbow pain, like tennis elbow or something like that? How do you address that? Because, it's a difficult problem and there's lots of different inputs. How would you go about it? And then I go, we've been talking about this a little bit in our clinic because we get people in, and I would openly say we don't always get good outcomes with it. And we've been working with some hand therapists on this, and they've been pushing this notion of being a lot more aggressive with immobilization, which, on our end is usually like, oh, we don't really want to, put someone in a splint or a brace for very long. But they're kind of pushing this idea, and I think they might be right. Maybe they're getting better outcome, or they are getting better outcomes than we are by keeping them out of that. So it's like, okay, we need to be open to that idea because it's something that we're more attracted and more motivated by getting a good outcome than we are by, our own ego around us being right with the methodology or the way in which we approach the problem.
Sure. If we just shift pace a little bit, can you talk to? I mean, because I imagine when a patient comes in, that if they're particularly associated with sport, that they're going to do some sort of gait analysis. Can you talk about the recent rise of the super spikes or super shoes, especially with I guess recreational runners are the ones that you sort of see rolling around with these $350 alpha flies, and maybe talk to has it negatively or positively affected the biomechanics of their running gait, and has it impacted performance of high level and lower level athletes?
There's lots of factors in there. Like, I will openly say that I'm not an expert in shoe technology. I have a cursory understanding, and obviously I have some experience working with people doing this. So there are, I'll openly say there are people who know more about it. You probably know more about it than I do, so maybe you should answer this question. But I
don't know about that, but I think just I guess some people you hear that they've just bought them for I'm running my first half marathon, so I got to buy some alpha flies, and maybe performance improves straight away. But is it hasn't had a negative effect on the Achilles tendon over time or something like that?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that we have seen, particularly from an injury standpoint, is a significant increase in lower leg injuries. Whether that's foot, calf, Achilles, plantar fascia. And the main reason that we see that is obviously there's two factors in the shoes that are different to, say, a very standard running shoe. So prior to these shoes coming out, where they come out 2016, 2017, 2018, they started coming online. Prior to that, most shoes had a foam in them that was more dense, right? It didn't have as much compliance in it, and it wasn't giving you back as much bounce, right? And that's the whole, 4% was about, it's a 4%
Yep.
improvement in, the running economy and all of that kind of stuff because of the amount of compliance in the foam and how much absorption and force that it gave back to you. The thing that we're seeing is a lot of people don't have the tissue properties to be able to actually withstand that amount of force being put back through their foot, calf, ankle, Achilles. And so those tissues get overloaded quite quickly, right? The other factor is obviously...
Is it like the shoe's an amplifier, or it's just the I guess the return or the recoil's a lot more aggressive?
It's a bit of both. It's a lot more aggressive, which means it amplifies the amount of force that's going through those tissues. And it's exactly what we spoke about in terms of understanding the biomechanical forces, right? And the relation that has to those other factors. We spoke about tissue properties, so how strong your calf is and all that. If you have a really strong calf and you have a really elastic calf, like you can bounce off you've got good, hopping capabilities and all of that, you go into these shoes, you're going to be okay because you've probably developed the ability to deal with those very high bouncing, jumping, running capabilities. But if you don't, and then all of a sudden you amplify that because of the technology and the way that the shoe makes you run, it pushes you into much more of a forefoot running gait, and it actually amplifies the amount of force going through that posterior, lower leg complex. If you don't have those tissue properties, we get what we spoke about, that stress life curve. With the repeated loading, it tends to cause failure within that tissue. And anything along that chain really is connected if we look at it anatomically. So something along there will tend to go. As I said, it may start from as simple as the plantar fascia, and then it goes, its connection up into the Achilles tendon, and then it might be something in the calf complex. It may also be something like bone stress. We've seen a fair bit of stress through, particularly like metatarsals and even things like tibial bone stress. And the factors that are associated with that is there's two. One's the foam. The other one is actually the carbon fiber plate that's in it, because it's a much firmer, much more give. And again, that's an amplifier. And it really, because of the rigidity of that, it forces people into much more of that forefoot running position, which the way that you run really does alter how much force is going through different tissues. So people always say, like, is there a right, foot strike mechanics? And it's not that there's a right or wrong. It's just to understand that, say, if you're a really heavy heel striker, it increases the amount of tibial, stress that happens on the initial contact. So if you're having a lot of, shin splints, right, type pain, and you're someone who's susceptible to the development of something like a tibial stress fracture, you may want to consider going to more of a full foot landing position and taking some of the force off that initial landing position and contact. And you've got to be careful with, for instance, with your shin angle and all that kind of stuff at the point of contact and maximum vertical loading position. If you're someone who likes to run on your toes, they tend to be the people that end up with Achilles pain and calf problems. And those are the ones that, for instance, talking to them about, okay, you're a recreational jogger, but you don't need to run with such a forefoot gait. You can run maybe a little bit more midfoot and try and distribute those forces across more tissue. Because again, biomechanically, if you think about it from a really basic engineering framework, which is not exactly how the bio part is really important in biomechanics. People think sometimes it's just mechanics, which is pure engineering and mathematics.
Yes.
The bio part's important, but you think about it, if you want to distribute forces, particularly ground reaction forces, across the most amount of tissue, you probably want to use the greatest base of support you can. So if you're only choosing to use a small amount of your foot as your point of contact, that's going to actually reduce the amount of base of support that you use. And so at a really basic level, think, okay, this person seems to be overloading one area a lot. How do I actually make sure that we get all of their lower leg, using, because we obviously want, the bigger muscles doing things, the hip muscles are the biggest muscles that we have really in our body. Can we use those? Well, you're not going to load those that well if you're only using a small portion of your foot, because you don't stack your joints very well. And then you don't get that nice, stabilization. And we talk about, overall lower limb stiffness. It's hard to create on a small base of support because contact time and all of these things. So that's how this interaction occurs. And so, we spend a lot of time looking at people's gait mechanics, taking video, You know, sometimes we'll measure forces using different technologies. We don't have them at the moment, but, you know, we've spoken before about things like the insole inserts that have, you know, IMUs in, you know, inertial moment units to give you an idea of, like, okay, what's the center of pressure, or how much force is going, what are the moments that are going through the foot that are occurring, or through a certain limb. Those are things that you can look at. And this new shoe technology, it's become one of those things where they are more aggressive. They tend to overload particularly the tissues that are associated with more of a forefoot running gait, which tend to be, as I said, the lower leg posterior structures, calf, Achilles complex, plantar fascia. And what we tend to speak to people about is see that as an added stressor. You know, you're actually upping the intensity of what you're doing, and you're increasing the forces. So it's the same as running faster. It's the same as increasing your ground reaction forces. How do you deal with that? Well, you've got to do it gradually. You've got to think about it like any rehabilitation or training prescription. You know, my current capacity is here, and I have added this stressor. Is it ready for that? You know, if it's only a little bit above your current capability, it'll probably tolerate it okay. But if you're down here and then you go, okay, we're going to start doing ground reaction forces up here, it's going to stress that quite quickly. So with those, we always talk about it with people, they're performance shoes. So they're like wearing footy boots. You don't necessarily wear your footy boots when you go for a jog as part of your pre-season training, right? Why? Because you don't need to. It's the same thing with these performance shoes. These are race shoes. You don't wear them for your very slow jog that you do on a Sunday that goes for an hour and a half, right?
Okay.
You would wear a much more general structured running shoe for that. You might use them for your interval runs, or you might use them for some of your faster track stuff, because that's the time when you are going to go faster, but the volume of it is not as high. There are ratios, so you need to be aware of that and you know, play with how much you use them. And the big thing we always talk about is cycling through your shoes and using different variations so that you are getting different stresses that builds up the capacity of those tissues. So that's a big part of, you know, managing people's and, you know,
it's like almost a
transition to these super shoes.
Like a periodization of your footwear almost across your training period.
Yeah, and you have to do that. You know, you would know as a sprint coach, you do that as well, even with sprint athletes, where they go from, you know, you'll use earlier in the preseason where maybe you're doing a bit more volume of running, you're going to be using a standard running shoe more than you'll be running in spikes. And the reason is because you know that if they were to do that in spikes, the forces that they're being exposed to, particularly in their lower limb, are going to be higher. And everyone, as a sprint coach, if you give too many, you know, sessions that are in spikes early in the season, you don't always necessarily get major problems, but you might get shin splint type pain. You might get, you know, some Achilles soreness. You might get people, you know, even in general, is complaining of calf, you know, delayed onset muscle soreness. They're like, oh, my calves are killing me. You know, the first, you know, 2-3 weeks of wearing spikes a little bit more often. That's normal, right? Yep. And you just have to be aware of that and how you, as you said, periodize that in. Okay, I need a little bit more stress, a little bit more stress, a little bit more stress.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. Now, I obviously don't want to keep you all morning because I'm sure you have a very busy day of clients as well. But I guess just to conclude, you know, what would you give as far as your, you know, maybe your 2 or 3 overall tips for, you know, graduate physiotherapists as they start to enter the workforce? And I guess it can be related to what we're talking about this morning, or just in general.
I think the biggest one is be humble. Ask more questions, as many questions as you can. And seek out good mentors. I think they're probably the sort of 3 things that you can do. There's probably others as well. One key one is, it sounds really silly, but actually listen to the person in front of you. As a graduate, I think I made the mistake a lot of, you know, seeing the injury and not the person. You know, and a really silly example of that is, you know, giving a recommendation for, say, a treatment that they're not interested in doing. You know, if you say to someone, oh, for this injury, you know, like you should get surgery for this, and they say, like, that's just not on the radar for me. You know, that's just not something I'm interested in. And you keep pushing, like, okay, I want you to go see this surgeon. I want you to go, and they don't come back. And you say, well, why did they disappear? It's like, well, you weren't listening to them. You were just offering them what you thought was the best solution for them, and you need to listen to the person in front of you. Now, that doesn't mean that they always necessarily get what would be considered evidence-based practice, right? And you obviously need to adhere to that as closely as possible. But as long as you document what you do and you say, I've recommended this, I've educated them on this, they've still chosen that they would prefer not to have surgery, you're putting the patient first, because it's a big thing that we talk about evidence-based practice a lot in evidence-based medicine. Most people don't know what that is. They think it's literature. It's not literature. Well, part of it's literature. It was developed in 1992 by a guy named David Sackett, who's actually a physician, medical doctor, and it's three pillars. One pillar is literature, so it's a third. That's 33%. Well, and clinically relevant literature, not just something that's not related to your population group. The second thing that it is clinical experience, right? So actually taking the knowledge that you developed over time. And the third thing is patient values and expectations, and they're equally weighted. So you might have your experience and the values and expectations of that patient, based on the subjective information you gathered from, that completely contradict the literature. And you'd actually be doing higher level of evidence-based practice than if you just followed the literature and ignored what they said and ignored what you'd seen in the past. And people seem to really balk at that, but go and read David Sackett's original work on an evidence-based practice. It's not just, oh, the literature says this, therefore I have to do that, because that's really dangerous, and it means you're not listening to the person that's in front of you. You're probably not going to get good outcomes.
And obviously, in your profession, you obviously want to work through with the client from start to finish. So getting them to come back and having that rapport with them is obviously pretty key.
It's huge. It's huge. It's everything. Like you need to have a level of, it's a professional relationship, and they're there to get an outcome. But you need to have enough rapport that they trust that you're providing the best level of care that you can. If you're ignoring them, you're not even looking at them as they're talking, it's not going to work. They think, oh, this guy is a jerk. He's not interested in me. He's just saying, oh, I've sent you this protocol and do this, and I'm referring you to the surgeon. It's like, no, I said to you I don't want to go to surgery. So you have to be willing to do that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I might finish up there, and like I said to you earlier, John, I really appreciate all the advice and support you've given me and my athletes over the time, and you're a big strength to the Australian athletics community, and obviously to your colleagues as well.
Well, I appreciate that, mate. Thank you.
All right, thanks, mate.